with this slide talking about cold water corals. So you should already have this in your notes. So I just want to reaffirm, now that you know so much about nematocysts and zooxanthellae, that these are corals that live in dark, cold water, and they are not able to they do not photosynthesize with this symbiotic zooxanthellae, and therefore they can only feed on passing prey. I think we talked about that in class. This is kind of a cool, anyway, these are all new discoveries. This is a new one, a new coral that was found off of California. I just wanted to point out the polyp shape that you're now very familiar with that forms the living tissue of the coral. This one is just a long strand. Looks very similar to a sea fan, like the California gorgonian that I passed around, the skeleton of that. And you can see there's not a lot going on around it, but these areas are creating much richer communities because they exist in these deep waters. There's a lot of them. There's thousands of species, and obviously many more to be discovered. Lots of different versions of that sea fan look that I showed you on in our last class, or before the breakfast, before the Tuesday before breakfast. You can see the polyp, you can see the coralite behind it. It's a soft body, particularly this one up in the upper right. You can see that beautiful green pulp with the mouth and tentacles, and then the purple feathery coralite. But anyway, super exciting that there's areas that have cold, dark areas that still have corals, because we used to always think it was such a warm water, sunlit thing. But there are exceptions. So here's a cool area off California that has, and some of you are probably already IDing these structures. These are shark egg cases. There are certain areas where the cold coral communities are nursing grounds for sharks, like huge numbers of sharks coming together, mating, laying their eggs around the coral. We don't understand this, but it's something that exists, so it's definitely something that we want to study. But that's just one of those amazing things that happens when you start to look around in the ocean. I thought you would like seeing this new discovery as well that I came upon, that obviously once you have these cold, dark communities that have life around them, then you're not only discovering new coral species, you're discovering other species. And this is a crab that was named after Harry Potter and Snape, because it was discovered and then 30 years ago and then disappeared for 30 years, so they're considered to be very secretive. So the genus is all about Harry, and then Plax, it refers to the guy who discovered it. And then Severus is totally all about Severus Snape, because they say he kept the most important secret of the Harry Potter story. So this secretive crab deserves such a noble name, but I thought you guys would enjoy that. David Attenborough has some stuff to say about cold corals that I thought you might like to see some footage of some areas of newly discovered coral. So here's our buddy Dave.
Comes from the dark waters 400 feet down, 150 meters deep, off the Scottish island of Minkele. The word coral conjures up images of blue tropical waters, not the dark depths of the deep sea. But in fact, over half the coral species we know today are found in such waters, not on shallow tropical reefs. Lophelia.org is about these cold water corals, the habitats they form and the threats they face. Lophelia is the world's most widespread and important cold water coral, and such corals gradually form huge deep-sea colonies and reefs. Only in the last few years have we discovered that these reefs are found across the globe from north to south, taking thousands or even millions of years to form. The reefs, in turn, create a rich habitat for many other species, from simple filter-feeding sponges to predatory sharks and other fish. In fact, these deep-water corals have been known for a long time. This is a book by Philip Goss, one of the great Victorian naturalists, about the corals around the British Isles. And here is a picture with exactly the coral I showed you before.
I thought you might like that, to sort of even have some ideas about your scientific art too, that people have really been caring about these corals for a long time, although not having the ability to see them, because we didn't, when that naturalist worked there, we didn't have the technology for seeing these deep areas, but now obviously we do. And actually, David talks about Lophelia.org. Lophelia is the genus. I'm not going to ask you this, but I just want to make sure you understood it as you were listening to the narration or listening to him talking about the corals. He's a guest speaker at that website, and that's what that's about. So, anyway, some cool areas. And I hope that you were noticing some of the different species that were showing up in that video as he was talking, and the areas and the depths were pretty remarkable. Okay, so let's talk about human impact on coral reefs. Um, it's unfortunate that humans are having a wide impact on reefs. I want you to understand that, but I want you also, so this is going to be kind of the Debbie Downer part of the lesson, but then there is some good news, so don't worry, good news on the horizon, but to be, the educated scientist that you are, you need to have the full picture of what's going on. So this is not new to you. I'm sure there's a wide, just as I showed you a map of coral tropical reef areas that are prevalent on the planet. This is also the area with the warmest temperatures, also the area with the highest human population. So sea surface temperatures are a big problem for corals, and I just want to point out in this particular chart some deeply troubling areas that are in the very highest range in temperature. We don't understand why these areas are as warm as they are, but that obviously red is not good either, but when you get into these maroon colors on this particular scale, that can be a real problem. And so we're trying to understand those areas and trying to understand why that's a problem. But anyway, this is a problem for corals, and here's why. Connor, you talked about this. Well, I mentioned zooxanthellae that you remember bleaching in another part of your life, and then we talked about this with anemone bleaching, which is Kaylee's research area, so you'll hear more about that. But coral bleaching, when they get into those high temperatures I just showed you, or even just above normal, these corals will literally just spit, the polyp will spit out its zooxanthellae. So that is a problem. And then once they do that, they go from this coloration. Remember, this is the normal coloration for the corals. This is the bleached coloration. Just like the coral specimens I showed you in class, they look very white because they have no zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae gives its color. Once it expels, this is what it looks like. And then there's no more food arriving from the expelled zooxanthellae. These particular warm water, shallow corals don't have enough. There's not enough food in the water for them to be able to eat enough food to survive. Because remember, they do not only have the symbiotic algae, but they also eat and they starve. So, in National Geographic just did a study that showed that some corals will, after they expel their zooxanthellae, they will take on a new, more heat-tolerant group, but we're not sure, and then survive, but we're not sure what that means in terms of coral diversity. So bad news for corals on bleaching. In the warm water, this is true everywhere. This is what we've seen with our sea star virus, our denzovirus for sea star wasting syndrome, and with our new sea urchin virus. Viruses tend to do very well in the warm water. And this black band disease will create basically a big scar across the living surface of the reef and kill that white area. This white area is now all dead. And they call this black band disease because a black band kind of precedes this scarring. So it kind of creeps along the surface. I know it's super creepy. I'm sorry, this photo is covering up the rest of this bullet, that tend to be related to low water quality. So if you could please add that to your notes, that not only are the coral viruses prevalent in warm waters, they also seem to be more prevalent in areas that have low water quality. So human population, wastewater heading out to sea in coral areas. Again, these impoverished nations that don't have the technology for wastewater treatment are going out into reefs and causing these viruses. So bad news, bad news, bad news. Okay, another huge one, ocean acidification. A lot of you probably know about this, and I know this is just like boom, boom, boom. It's just like getting pounded with all these impacts, but we do have some good news, so don't worry. Okay, so we burn fossil fuels in our cars and our power plants. That releases carbon. That carbon goes into the atmosphere. The ocean draws up this carbon. We're going to do a quick little demonstration experiment of that on Monday. That the coral carbon, from this burning of fossil fuels gets drawn up by the ocean. It's just not only by its plankton, but also gets drawn into solution in the ocean. And when you add CO2 to a solution, it makes it more acidic. So the pH drops in the form of carbonic acid. There's a whole process that happens when you add when the CO2 is added. It forms carbonic acid in solution, and then the coral can no longer grow in those conditions, in part because it doesn't have the calcium carbonate available to build its skeleton, but also it actually erodes or in those acidic conditions. So not a good situation for coral. So let me repeat that not only can the coral does it have difficulty growing and building its skeleton because the calcium carbonate that it needs, that's usually in solution, has been broken apart, that compound, by the change in pH, by the lower pH. And then secondly, the actual existing coral structures, the exoskeletons, just like the structures I showed you in class, will begin to dissolve, literally dissolve in the water around them. On top of this, there's just all kinds of other problems that happen because of ocean acidification that we're not even fully aware of. And actually, Dr. Attenborough believes that the problem with sea star wasting is related to ocean acidification. Here's the last few minutes of a TED Talk on ocean acidification that I thought you might enjoy, just in case that explanation came at you kind of fast. And obviously, this guy's really has some good thoughts on ocean acidification. So let's listen into this.
I'll close with a short discussion of ocean acidification. I like it as a component of global change to talk about, because even if you are a hard-bitten global warming skeptic, and I talk to that community fairly often, you cannot deny the simple physics of CO2 dissolving in the ocean. We're pumping out lots of CO2 into the atmosphere from fossil fuels, from cement production. Right now, about a third of that carbon dioxide is dissolving straight into the sea, right? And as it does so, it makes the ocean more acidic. So you cannot argue with that. That is what's happening right now. And it's a very different issue than the global warming issue. It has many consequences. There's consequences for carbonate organisms. There's many organisms that build their shells out of calcium carbonate, plants and animals both. The main framework material of coral reefs is calcium carbonate. That material is more soluble in acidic fluid. So one of the things we're seeing is organisms are having to spend more metabolic energy to build and maintain their shells. At some point, as this transient, as this CO2 uptake in the ocean continues, that material is actually going to start to dissolve. And on coral reefs, where some of the main framework organisms disappear, we will see a major loss of marine biodiversity. But it's not just the carbonate producers that are affected. There's many physiological processes that are influenced by the acidity of the ocean. So many reactions involving enzymes and proteins are sensitive to the acid content of the ocean. So all of these things, greater metabolic demands, reduced reproductive success, changes in respiration and metabolism, these are things that we have good physiological reasons to expect to see stress caused by this transient. So we've figured out some pretty interesting ways to track CO2 levels in the atmosphere going back millions of years. We used to do it just with ice cores, but in this case, we're going back 20 million years, and we take samples of the sediment, and it tells us the CO2 level of the ocean, and therefore the CO2 level of the atmosphere. And here's the thing. You have to go back about 15 million years to find a time when CO2 levels were about what they are today. You have to go back about 30 million years to find a time when CO2 levels were double what they are today. Now, what that means is that all of the organisms that live in the sea have evolved in this chemostatic ocean with CO2 levels lower than they are today. That's the reason that they're not able to respond or adapt to this rapid acidification that's going on right now. So Charlie Viren came up with this statement last year: the prospect of ocean acidification may well be the most serious of all of the predicted outcomes of anthropogenic CO2 release. And I think that may very well be true. So I'll close with this. We do need the protected areas, absolutely. But for the sake of the oceans, we have to cap or limit CO2 emissions as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
It is good to. It is really good to hear scientists um, full on talk about that and say we've just got it. You know,
Investment
I
in
talk to
broadband
these people a
high-speed
lot,
internet can help small
and
business.
there's a series of problems that are existing in science today where a lot of people are not willing to step forward and say things like CO2 emissions have to come down now. I hope you understood that what he was saying when he referred to the CO2 problem and then mentioned warming, that tends skeptics of climate change tend to talk more about the temperature and oh well it's so cold this winter, how could there be such a thing as climate change? But he's saying you can't dispute these CO2 numbers. They're indisputable. Okay, a lot of that was coming at you kind of fast, and I just wanted to make sure you guys realize that everything that we just talked about, bleaching, diseases, and acidification, all comes from, is all about climate change. So it's the increase in sea surface temperature leads to the bleaching. The increase in sea surface temperature plus water quality problems leads to uh, greater coral diseases, and then the increase in CO2. That's really the whole basic problem that leads to climate change is also causing this acidification. And in the corals, again, this is probably, I'm just reviewing so you kind of test yourself to make sure you got this from the screencast from this lesson, is that the corals not only have trouble building their skeletons because the calcium carbonate is not available in solution, and then also they lose their current skeleton to erosion or dissolution. Okay, we're almost getting to the good news. So this is also a huge problem, especially because it's part of the aquarium trade. So Sean, I'm really sorry. You got to hear it. This is a problem. That cyanide fishing in these areas we've talked about that are impoverished. This is a quick way to make money in these areas. This man is totally illegal everywhere, but he's squirting cyanide, which you know is a poison, into reef crevices. This causes fish to come out of the reef where they're hiding. Most will die immediately from exposure to the toxin. Others will be grabbed in plastic bags. Another half of those will die on the way, and then what's left is sold in the aquarium for the aquarium trade, and then a collateral damage to that is that any coral that is touched by the cyanide, even though these guys are not after the coral, they're after the fish, dies as well. So please make sure you can pause this and make sure you have all these bullets, but basically putting this cyanide into these reef crevices kills the fish either immediately or later, and all of this is fueled by the aquarium trade. It's a huge problem. So we're going to be working with some of these impacts in class on Tuesday, but here's sort of some other things that don't need much explanation. Blast fishing, which is where, like the first slide I showed you, dynamite. It stuns fish. This kills fish immediately to eat, and it kills coral. Overfishing, where you just take too much. A lot of people love the coral, and so ecotourism is a bit of a problem, but we actually have we actually have you know issues where we have various groups that don't responsibly use the reef, and so I showed you this middle picture here is people literally just standing on top of coral polyps and hard corals. So that's what I mean by destructive boating and diving activities, and sometimes they actually will drop anchor right on a coral head. So ecotourism is good as long as people are, and obviously people want to see the living reef, but these people standing on this coral is just a huge problem. Collection corals we already talked about for aquariums. Eutrophication, that's what this slide is showing. Not just the single-celled algae blooming and causing drops in oxygen, but this is actually an algae that's literally just blanketing the reef. You can see this cool fish here that's kind of camouflaging with it, but this is a reef area that's just blanketed in algae. And it might not seem as if this is a problem, but fish feeding is not a good thing because actually you really should not have sharks that come up and feed from people. It can make them too tame and too aggressive. So that's not a good thing. But there are some good things going on that are helpful. Sean was referring to this in class. There are people that are planting coral. You go out into coral rubble areas or areas destroyed by storms, and you can place coral in other areas where it's needed, and it will start to grow. And also this over here. So this is what this guy's up to, is planting coral. And then, but also over here, there was a recent discovery in Australia where they found corals inside the mangrove swamps. You can see the prop roots right here. This scientist is diving through trying to look for corals to identify them. And they found that these corals can thrive not only in the warm, tepid, high turbidity, like low water quality areas of the mangroves that we talked about in estuaries, but also those are acidic conditions because of the decomposition going on. So these are corals that we think are going to be survive some of the conditions in the current ocean. The guy in the TED Talk was talking about, no animals in the ocean today are adapted for that kind of pH, but these new corals that are being discovered in the mangrove swamps of Australia. So that's kind of cool. This is also such a wonderful new discovery that National Geographic is running called Bright Spots. And this is, they found these areas where people do actually live on the reef, like their livelihood comes from the reef. In those areas where it's the native people in that particular area, let's say like the Solomon Islands are very well known for bright spots. If the areas are used sustainably, people are good stewards of their reefs. Those are the reefs that are doing the best. Reefs where food is taken away by other countries that come in to take the fish, particularly in Asia, Asian fishing practices where they come in, big ships that come in to take the fish. Those are doing the worst. But it's not that fishing is a problem, it's that when you take too many of the fish. So these local people do a very good job of taking just enough, just what they need, and keeping things going. They're very knowledgeable about that. They've grown up for thousands of years with families needing the reef, but they call those bright spots. And I thought you'd like to see that in bright spots, there's been studies done that show that they have like significantly higher fish species and coral diversity in these areas where people are harvesting from the reef, but responsibly. A perfect example of sustainability. People taking what they need and nature not being harmed. So I thought you'd like that. And then there's also some really great things that we can do. Obviously, the number one thing is reduce our CO2 footprint. Let people know what's going on, obviously, with reefs since we don't have any nearby. You really cannot be, if you're in those countries or here, you should not buy coral, not buy products of coral. Don't buy jewelry made from coral or other products from the reef. The CO2 footprint thing is the biggest one. Oh no, drive your car less, things of that sort. We really need to, especially now in the current political climate, demand legislation that protects our reefs. When you go on vacation, go on an ecotourism vacation, go to the living reef, show that these living reefs are worth money. This is a huge one. This is what one of our Galapagos trip. You spend a lot of money in these places. And so people need to see, oh, I'm not going to take that coral head and sell it to this person. I'm going to charge this other person to come and look at it. And then the organization that we're going to work with on Tuesday and that Sean's doing his research on is Reef Check. This is groups that are monitoring reefs. This is a volunteer out monitoring a reef and then sharing that data. So an extremely cool group that's doing that. And this is just one of the ways that we're going to be spending time on Tuesday just sort of looking at the data that they collect. But this is an important idea, is all the things that we can do to help our reefs. Okay, so guys, also I'm going to send you an email. Also, go ahead and read your coral reefs chapter this week and get that done. And we'll kind of review this on Monday. But please let me know. Email me with questions. Okay. Thank you. See you Monday. Bye.